Welcome to Chef Leadership Academy. This presentation is India in the New World Order. How will India reposition itself to be a strategic global player is the theme of this presentation. I will talk about the old world order before the collapse of communism and talk about the rise of India. My main point is going to be that India has all the ingredients but no recipe. And therefore, what is the recipe and what can India do to benefit from the new world order? So let's start by looking at the old world order. The world economic aspects were organized around primarily Western Europe, US and Canada, and later entered Japan. Americans had defeated the Japanese, defeated the Germans. They could organize one single approach or a viewpoint on the world. 75% of the GDP was only among these 15 nations. Rest of the world did not matter. Countries like China and India with large populations were like tiny islands, and countries like Canada, very small population, looked like giant continents. 45% of the trade was organized among these 15 nations, and the number is lower because they still imported lots of raw materials from their former colonies, both agricultural raw materials and industrial raw materials. What is common among all these 15 nations is that they are all aging and aging rapidly, with Japan leading the world, or among these 50 nations, Germany following it, and the US also eventually following. World was stable. There was a balance of power between communism and capitalism. There were no little causes. Civil wars were a lot less common. They all organized into one global cause called communism, or under global ideology called capitalism. Cold War was a common front for the Western allies. There was a harmonious economic, military, and political viewpoint among these 15 nations which ruled the world. They created IMF, International Monetary Fund, World Bank, and the United Nations to again impose a world order. This has changed dramatically. The world has changed after the collapse of communism in 1989, 1990, 1991, whatever time you give. Smartphones and social media have come. Public acrimony is incredibly very different than what it used to be. There are no actually gatekeepers or people who would control editorially what you can and cannot say in public. All these nations, as I mentioned, are rapidly aging, advancing nations. They don't see the future themselves in their own growth, domestic markets primarily. You have the new trade regime, WTO. The old GATT agreements were given in order to create economic growth. We leaned toward trade because domestic markets were not growing. That lasted for about 25 years. Terrorism has gone global rather than local. It is no longer just the Taliban's, let's say, in Afghanistan, but it is all over the world with newer players. And now we also have new leaders in the world. Prime Minister Modi on the one hand in India, to President Xi Jinping in China, and President Donald Trump in America. This is a very different world than the world that we knew before. The new triad power economically that has gained enormous momentum in the last 25, 30 years is now India, United States, and China. In other words, both Japan on the one hand and the Western European countries, now EU in some fashion, are getting marginalized by the rise of China and India. And I have therefore founded an institute called India China America Institute. I think from a policy perspective, the trilateral relationship will be more strategic, especially for India, than any bilateral understanding or bilateral policy aspects. We wanted to call it China India America Institute, but we could not because acronym is CIA Institute, which is a brand you don't want to have. So what is the new world order or disorder? China has now emerged as the economic superpower. There is no question. There is no denial anymore that China is on the rise and will actually become the largest single economy and also technology leader. There is a discord among traditional allies and alliances, whether it's a NATO alliance or US versus Canada, US versus, let's say, European Union for that matter. Most of that is discord about the politics on the one hand, military on the other hand, and a third one, of course, and most important one, I think, is economic. Populism is on the rise everywhere. Doesn't matter whether you have a communist belief system, whether you have a democracy system, whether you have a monarchy system, it does not seem to be there. There seems to be this huge desire by the people to say, how can we throw away incumbents? It does not sound even rational thinking, but it does not matter. So populism is becoming a very key change agent in the way we look at the world in the future. Asia-centric economic and military pivot. World is definitely moving away from the American-centric century, which was the last century, or the European century before that one in 1800s. The 21st century clearly belongs the first half to Asia, not only traditional players like Japan, South Korea, but also China, India, and the ASEAN bloc. I can even add Australia and New Zealand if you wanted to, but it's all Asia-centric. The world is pivoting both militarily as well as economically toward Asia. So look east becomes very key. We also have the rise of new middle class in emerging markets. This new middle class is very different. There's a discontinuity from one generation to the other in almost a sharp way. Very little things that we knew from the previous family are now transferable to the newer families. All over the world. They don't want to buy from the neighborhood grocery stores. They don't want to buy unbranded products. All of them want branded products, branded rice, atta in India, wherever. It does not make any difference. That's the new world order now in terms of a key change. And this new middle class has aspirations to go someplace. They are not at all interested in status quo as their parents were or grandparents were. We also have a large political and social acrimony globally. I mean, this is the Twitter age. Instant communication, instant insults, instant apologies. Doesn't make any difference. That's very disturbing on the one hand, but it creates an inflammatory environment. World is always on the edge. What is the next major announcement by some world leader in a manner that is just not even appropriate? But the content may not be right, and definitely the style is not right. And in the process, capital markets are in turmoil. The volatility or the beta index is on the rise, not just in American stock markets, Indian stock markets, Chinese stock markets, European stock markets. Does not make any difference. Capital markets are on the edge because they don't understand where the turmoil comes from or how it comes. I think, surprisingly, contrary to all the popular belief, this is a good time for India. In that trilateral relationship, US and China are diverging in their viewpoints, have taken very strong stands, not just militarily, economically, politically, always there was a difference, but it is amplifying. India is in that very strategic position to either align with the Americans or to align with the Chinese, or is this another time for non-alignment movement, which was disastrous when we started after independence? This is a strategic dilemma. But I believe this dilemma can be resolved very well and will be very helpful to the nation's rise as a truly global player. This is because I believe India has all the ingredients but does not have the recipe. Many nations have right ingredients but no recipe. What's the recipe? Recipe is the vision. Recipe is repositioning for the future. Vision is all about positioning for the future. And this is very important exercise policymakers have to go through, get a consensus going, and move the country, in this case India, from where it is right now or where it was to where it needs to go. Generally, all visions, whether those are corporate visions, nation visions, personal visions, are always aspirational. They're hope in the future, positive. They are proactive. It is not as if gods are blessing me and therefore I will be just tell what the gods want me to do, or I'll be an instrument of the destiny in some fashion. But it says that I can take charge and position myself for the future. And they have a mission-driven attitude. It's not as if I will do it, but it says by this time I will do it this way. It's like man on moon, kind of a Kennedy's vision at one time. It's like Singapore repositioning for a really truly global hub city. It would be something that many states have gone through, cities have definitely gone through, repositioning themselves and having a mission. By this time we will achieve our objectives, and there are strong measurements to see how well you are doing. So what are the India's ingredients? Let's just analyze that first. I may suggest some things that may be non-intuitive, but you might say on reflection, aha, that makes sense. Because that's what I found in my research. The first major ingredient India has, it needs to leverage and use it to position itself for the future, is the deep diplomatic reach. As a nation, India has either high commissions or outposts or full-blown embassies all over the world. It deals with this new disorder in the world. Deals with countries like North Korea, Iran on the one hand, to France and Germany and America on the other hand, to Japan, South Korea, to all of the Middle East countries. No matter how we look at it, the reach, diplomatic reach, is very deep. Those are the listening posts. Those are the places you learn where the world is going and places where you plant ideas. So I believe one very key ingredient of India is its Ministry of External Affairs. How can government use that ministry for positioning its future? Second one is global diaspora. Indian diaspora has done extremely well all over the world. It is not the traditional labor pool that went under the British Empire, either as a bonded labor in sugarcane fields or cotton fields. But new diaspora is highly educated. New diaspora is intellectually powerful. It is wired with all of the influencing agencies such as education, for example, government, for example, or even on the legislative side, not just on the administrative side. And India needs to learn how to leverage its diaspora. At one time, diaspora was ignored, looked down. Many of the Indian scholars began to call the people who lived abroad to say, you are deserters. You have no interest in India as a country or a nation. Of course, this was Indian perspective. When you talk to each of the diaspora members, they always had this affinity for India What can I do for India? But the receptivity on the other side was very poor. Many people tried to do things in India with and came back with disillusionment. What can government do to leverage this another ingredient and come out with something very good? I believe we have underestimated the power of the Indian global diaspora. First of all, it's not only size-wise large, but it's global at the same time. Third, it is the second largest consumer market for everything, not just the cell phones or the internet-based networks or the automobiles, appliances, garments, no matter anything you look. And today an economy is 60-70% primarily consumer markets. A little more on the services side than products that it used to be, but see the consumers who drive the economic behavior of a nation or globally. So US would be 75% consumer economy driving the GDP. China is about 60-65%. India would be in the same category. So the consumer market becomes very strategic ingredient. It's a market that the world has to play just to be equalized in global competition. So if the Japanese come to India, Koreans have to come, Chinese have to come, Germans have to come, French have to come, Americans have to come. No matter how difficult it is to do business, because that's where the markets are, if you are competing on the same product lines. I think we need to leverage that resource India has in terms of strategic repositioning of India. Fourth, which is a newer resource, is digital talent. There is no other nation in the world in scale, volume, size as what India has in terms of its digital talent, software engineers, hardware engineers, whatever you call them. And that digital talent is growing in larger quantities because the nation has a huge population. And more people want to be software engineers, or STEM as we call it, science, technology, engineering, math, whatever it is. It's a great, great asset to nurture, to invest, and to grow. We also have a strong soft power. India's soft power is quite impressive. When I travel all over the world and when they find out I'm of Indian origin as opposed to any other origin, they smile. They immediately begin to pay attention to what I'm saying. You can see the body language change. Doesn't matter where you are in the world. And it is true that Indian intellectuals from the days of our philosophers from ancient days, all through the independence struggle, always dominated world thinking. We have brilliant mathematicians, theoretical physics, medical doctors, medical scientists, all over the world. India's growing soft power is no longer anchored primarily to our ancient scriptures, ancient knowledge, philosophy, which is great, or the heritage, but it is toward where everything future is going. Whether it is in science, technology, artificial intelligence, virtual reality, economic aspects, it makes no difference. It's the future areas and competencies of India that's very important to utilize or leverage in some fashion. But there is a growing soft power. It needs to be organized, it needs to be channeled, and it needs to be promoted properly. China has done a great job with Confucius Institutes, a little more on the cultural side. The world is less of a cultural aspects or language aspects and more about science, technology, space programs. I can give you examples after examples, but I want to make a point. Look toward the future soft power, not the past soft power. Point number 6. India is a strong military power also. Again, China will dominate the military, both tactical and strategic, ground and space. as US is a dominant player. But in no small way, India is excellent. Not only in the space program, nuclear technology, but also well-grounded army. It is not easy in a poor infrastructure with lack of modern equipment and everything to be a good soldier, and we have good soldiers. Taking pride on Indian military is very important. If you look at the rest of the world, they've always taken pride in their military. US excels in that area. So how do we make sure that the average population strongly believes in the Indian military, would like to serve in the military as if it's a national honor in some fashion? Strong military is an important ingredient toward the success and the survival of any nation. 7. This is non-intuitive. The Russian connection is very important going forward. No matter what the Western press tells, Russia and China are inevitable new powers that people will have to contend with. Fortunately, India has a deep relationship with Russia, over 50 years, 60 years now roughly. That needs to be leveraged in a positive way. Russia is equally important, as is America for India, as is China, as is Japan, as is Germany, Britain, etc. And the last area, which I think is most interesting, now we have a strong positive self-image and self-confidence. Average Indian has given up the defeatist attitude, takes pride on being Indian. I can do it. Can-do attitude, as we call it, seems to prevail. Not only just in technical entrepreneurship and coming out with unicorn, $1 billion+ valuation startup companies, but it seems to be true across the board. That spirit of self-image, positive self-image, I think is very key. Again, as a good ingredient, what can we do in a recipe to utilize that properly? Fundamentally, what the policymakers and the country has to do is to reposition India for the future. That's the vision is all about. And India, if you analyze it, was primarily isolated domestic economy since the foundation or the founding of the nation, with its republic in 1950, independence in 47. We decided primarily to have a license Raj focus on India, use Lenin's commanding heights theory, for example, more public sector, private sector not allowed, and mostly domestic orientation, which may have been right for its time, but is definitely not appropriate going in the future. So India has to go from isolated domestic economy to more and more integrated global economy. This is what China is doing after the Ming Dynasty. This is what Japan ended up doing after World War II. This is what South Korea ended up doing also. I can give you examples after examples as to why in the future nation cannot remain isolated domestic in its economic behavior. So that's one dimension. The second dimension is that India's diplomacy was primarily regional. Either West Asia as a region or the SAARC nations as a region in neighborhoods. Today, India has to become global diplomat. So its diplomacy has to go from the regional diplomacy to more and more global diplomacy. So how can India become strategic globally? So here are several recommendations. I think I have about 12 of them. First, deepen diplomatic relationship with surprisingly G7 nations, both professionally and personally. Deploy diplomats with or without seniority considerations to those key nations which are a part of G7 architecture. It is still a very large economic power, political power, and of course military power. We need to learn how to deal with them with equal ease on a parity as we have learned how to deal with regional nations. Engage with Russia and China with a new perspective. I would call a fresh new perspective. There's a huge legacy of the old thinking from the Cold War days or the 1962 war. The asymmetry of trust is incredible between India and China on the one hand, and to some extent India and Russia on the other hand. But as I mentioned, these two are very strategic nations. While we may focus on the G7 nations, it is very important to reduce the trust deficit with China. Third, offer Indian diplomats and diplomacy for track 2, back-channel negotiations and conflict resolutions. Track 1, or the official negotiations, is one thing. Today everything has to be done also track 2 negotiations. And the world is in so much conflict that you need to constantly have an engagement where former diplomats, former think tank, former professors, former advisors, whoever they are, can be used, aggregated as potential to talk informal conversations and organize and make it into bringing the parties to the table for formal signing ceremonies. I think it's very important. And India knows Middle East better than most of the nations. All the way from Egypt on the one hand, Saudi Arabia, Iran of course, to every country. We have a deep, deep understanding of Middle East for centuries almost, during the British Empire and definitely after the British Empire. We can be very good track 2 intermediaries for the rest of the world which is struggling with the Middle East right now. Point number 4, very important. Embrace global standards and global benchmarks for domestic products and services. Doesn't matter whether you are a state enterprise or a private enterprise. Global standards is the only way you can survive in the future because competition will be global even in domestic markets. It's inevitable that unless our companies and corporations aspire to global standards, they probably can't survive. Whether it is in appliances business or consumer electronics business or the auto business, doesn't make any difference. Now, India is one of the largest automobile component makers in the world, especially for small cars. It builds a lot of cars. Again, not the scale of China, but it is not shabby either. So to remain globally competitive, one has to have auto component standards either mandated by law for domestic market or industry associations organizing to benchmark globally. That will be true for pharmaceuticals. That will be true for processed foods. These are just a few examples. I think it's universal across all products and services. Point number 5, which is very likely to happen, is happening, is that India becomes global hub for professional talent. Make in India is a great initiative. While it was focused on manufacturing, Make in India is happening in services. All multinationals in IT and IT-enabled services, in newer technologies, are now finding that the only human talent mine in the world is in India. It's just like the gold mine. You go to where gold mines are if you want gold. You want to go to iron ore, you want to coal, where coal is. It's all about human capital, and India seems to be blessed with that surplus of talented people. Rather than sending them abroad as temporary guest workers in the Middle East or whatever it is, the world wants to come to India. You have seen large-scale employment of the human talent, especially professional services, out of multinationals such as Microsoft, Google, Ernst& Young, consultancy companies. I can go on naming after one after the other. And out of nowhere is not just Bangalore, but it is Hyderabad, it is Coimbatore, it is Pune. Every second tier city is having a huge growth. It is as good a talent to nurture as we have nurtured, let's say, diamond industry at one time, or the Bollywood on the other hand. So it has to declare itself as a global hub for professional services, starting at the low end, which we are giving it up, like the BPO business or the call centers, but moving up higher and higher. And the benchmarking is very simple in this case. What is the hourly wage that industry commands? So going away from $15, $20 that you can charge to a outsourcing company, how can you go up to $65, $100 per hour wage commanding, like special effects studios, legal services, accounting services is where the world needs to go, looking at India as a pool of talented people. That means creating education, certification in areas where the talent will be more valued by not just Indian corporations, but global enterprises. India clearly is having a great opportunity to become a second global sourcing destination. The rest of the world suddenly realizes that they have too many eggs in one basket called China in manufacturing. They're desperately looking about an alternative to China. With the new trade policies, tariffs, friction, it is becoming even more and more necessary that one cannot rely on China for all of its supplies for products, all quality. China does not make just low quality, it makes all quality. There needs to be an alternative sourcing place other than China, and most analysts in the world would think about India as a very logical place to go because we are blessed with natural resources, agricultural resources, animal resources, human resources, industrial resources. So rather than ship out the raw materials, is it possible for the world to come and do value add in India? It's very doable. And export more value added product from India as opposed to raw materials from India. I think de-risking from China is a very key opportunity that India can leverage. I believe Digital India is a great initiative. History will tell us how transformative and how strategic it was without knowing it. Sometimes you have an initiative, you have no understanding of all the consequences it will encounter, transform the society, not just the economy. Only historians can, looking back, and say that was more transformative than anything else India has done since its independence. So I'm a very strong advocate of Digital India. It provides us the rural-urban equalization. The world is flat, in this case within India between rural and urban. And how do we make it more flat? By Digital India initiative. India Stack is a great initiative. Aadhaar is a great platform. Can we have Aadhaar used for others rather than only for government identification, for polling purposes, security purposes? It can be actually privatized into a superhighway like the internet got privatized, or open architecture, whatever we call it. I think it's very important. Provide economic and social incentives to business enterprises for global presence. You cannot remain domestic when competition is global. E-commerce is here, which knows no boundaries whatsoever. I can get Indian products through Amazon and Alibaba if I wanted to. It is happening already. So given that, it's very important that Indian enterprises are given incentives, as we have done with SEZs before, to create a spark in the IT services industry. But is there another incentive that one gives which says you have to go global? And how can government or policy enable you to go global? Masters at this are Germans. We can learn from them. Small countries like Netherlands, we can learn from them. Japan was pretty much mandated after World War II by policymakers to be export oriented. Not just exports, but can we possibly invest into the rest of the world? And what can we do to generate more private capital, private equity, for example, which comes from all over the world, funds the institutions, business enterprises, public sector enterprises, but the mandate is to go global. This is clearly happening with Chinese state enterprises, whether those are Haier of the world, Lenovo of the world, Huawei technologies, no matter what you analyze, I don't see that kind of a massive national initiative to say, what can we do to motivate our private sector and government sector to go global first mentally? Unfortunately, when you have a large domestic market, the tendency would be to stay domestic. So this is a counterbalancing force one has to create through policy, incentives, education, however we do it. Encourage foreign direct investment in India for global markets. This is very, again, important. There is no way one can rely on domestic enterprises to serve the domestic market. Rather than having foreigners put their capital into FIIs or in the stock market where they can pull the money out anytime they want to, now you are committing yourself to the nation. So foreign direct investment is much better in my view than FII, and therefore what can we do to channel that capital to invest in India? And I know it's not the public stock market or the debt market, more likely it's going to be private equity market who can channel that for long-term investment into India. Automobile sector is a big one, but you don't invest in India only for the domestic Indian market, but also for a regional export market. Like in automobile, what they have done clearly, whether it is Nissan on the one hand, or whether it is, Toyota on the other hand, thinking about making it there, but supplying regionally. Pharmaceutical the same way, maybe globally. Military services, quite large market. And services that I'm talking about. And making in India, but for the world, not for India alone. I think that's a 9th recommendation. My 10th one is invest in business education for diplomats, military, and state enterprises. Ambassadors of tomorrow are going to be business savvy ambassadors, not just processing visas and crisis management for the citizens, not just for sort of the Cold War mentality and political debates and diplomacies. It is really economics. Ultimately, world politics is driven by economics. That's my conclusion in one of my books called Tectonic Shift. It's inevitable. All nations look at economics as a very key dimension now, and our diplomats are not trained having education in not just economics, but in business. Ambassadors are becoming trade ministers or trade missionaries. It's very important. So how do we create that thing? So we reposition the existing training colleges for our diplomatic people, for our military people, and for our state enterprise. All of these are very doable very immediately. Replace seniority based with merit based bureaucracy. I know I'm asking for something that like climbing the Mount Everest. Country has been organized around seniority from the time we got the independence, inherited the British approach to the bureaucracy, but I think the time has come to have a second look at it. All over the world, merit-based systems are replacing seniority-based systems, even in unionized industries. So if the world can do it, India can do it also. I think we can have all the excuses in the world, but excuses don't deliver the future. My view is that it's very important that we begin to reform the bureaucracies themselves in a way, not exceptions of individuals, but in a massive way to simply say, system will go from seniority to merit-based. We have talented people. And if you open up the merit-based system, you will see enormous amount of potential of the nation in these bureaucracies. Remember, it's not easy to pass administrative services examinations. It is not easy to pass foreign affairs, foreign policy examinations. These are talented people who somehow figured out they would love to contribute through the government bureaucracies rather than through private sector for whatever reason. How can we unlock their potential? And to me, it is right now bottled up by seniority system. As it used to be for the academic professors in Germany and Scandinavia, when I taught in Denmark in 1976, Ministry of Education will have so many professors. Until that person retired or died, you could not hire young talented people. So they say, I can't wait that long in my country. You had the exit of the talented brain power to neighboring countries. Till Germany reformed it, Scandinavia reformed it, so you can retain your talent. I think it's very important. So merit-based bureaucracy is the future. 12, and the last point, computerize, computerize, computerize. There is no other way I can explain this. Computerization is the new culture. Many, many years ago, I had advocated that the only way one can reduce corruption, not eliminate probably, but reduce corruption dramatically is to computerize everything. Not just tax filings or visas or airline reservations or railway reservations or anything. Computers is like breathing air in the future. There's no way out. Sooner the government deploys its capital to computerize everything, motivate people to do it, and of course we are very lucky in India bypassing the PC revolution and going straight into the cell phone revolution. So it's very universal. It can be done. But to me, this is very important. Computerization not only reduces corruption, but it actually encourages transparency and accountability. The record is there. I can go back. If there is any kind of a misbehavior, I can track it. It's very possible. And this is where I think India can leapfrog many of the advanced countries. As China is leapfrogging for its social agenda, whatever the reasons are, one can do it for our reasons. I do believe computerization, contrary to all the prior theories, enhances human capital rather than substitutes human capital. We all have fears of automation. I fully understand that. But human capital has never been destroyed. These debates happened when we mechanized agriculture 150 years ago. These debates happened when we mechanized the clerical workers through word processors. We agonize the same thing right now with the internet taking over professional jobs, such as accounting and legal. Human capital always will find something else to do which actually is higher wage, more meaningful than mundane activities. It always rises to the next opportunity and the challenge. So I don't worry about human capital despite all of these debates that we have created. So there are 12 specific recommendations which suggest how India can use its rich ingredients through a recipe and position the nation for the future. So let me conclude. There is a new geopolitical order, whether we like it or not. The traditional leaders and institutions are struggling to maintain world order. I would even go one step further and say are struggling to survive themselves. This has generated opportunity for new leaderships, such as Prime Minister Modi on the one hand, President Xi Jinping on the other hand. They're all newer leaders on a global theater. India is destined to become strategic globally, not just because what we do, but the world needs India more in its geopolitical order than ever before. Given the new triad power and the acrimony or lack of harmony between China and US, not only economically, militarily, and eventually politically, India becomes in the triad power very strategic, at least to the two superpowers, but rest of the world also. India has all the ingredients, but it is in search of a recipe. The recipe is the vision, which will reposition India from an isolated domestic economy to a globally integrated economy, and from primarily engaged in regional diplomacy to global diplomacy. It is not on the sidelines, but it is at the table. How can you get at the table in all of the major governments and their discussions is very important. The 12-point recommendations that I have made will ensure India's strategic place in the new world order. Thank you very much.